It pays to be on the winning side.
It's not a side we're talking about. It's a species called Homo sapiens. Ring a bell?
No, not with me, Jack. I'm too busy evolving.
You're on a one-way path, Stan. It's a dead end for all of us.
Don't fight it. It'll only win.
Scouring across the solar system, seeking planets and life forms to corrupt, Gudis proved to be one of the most evil foes in the Ultra series. Throughout the first 6 episodes, Gudis, after each defeat, transports his germ-like presence across the Australian continent, seeking whatever organism it can easily invade and mutate into a monstrous prodigy to reach its goal of taking over the planet, as well as the destruction of Ultraman. What makes the character so maniacal is its selfish motivation to mutate and consume entire populations of planets, dominating its victims' own consciousness in the process. Most are consumed with ease, serving as a near-perfect puppet for the Gudis' will. Some of the contaminated organisms can be aware of the Gudis' presence in its body, and will try to fight off the invader's control of its brain. This often forces the victim into a state of fear and frustration, which then culminates into the creature causing even greater havoc in its path. A prime example of this factor was in Episode 2, The Hibernator, in which Gudis possesses the dormant remains of a dinosaur, called a Gigasaurus, that had been frozen in ice since the Cretaceous period. Because of the reptile's cold temperature, it was somehow immune to Gudis' control, but the alien inhabitants in its body was enough to enrage the Gigasaurus, which is now equipped with a freezing vapor attack. Even worse, since it naturally thrives in a cold environment, the dinosaur found itself in a state of further torment while exposed to the terrible Australian heat. To make the story even more depressing, the Gigasaurus was terrified upon awakening in a location that was completely unfamiliar to it. These combined elements drove the poor creature into a rampage-like course of action, damaging, demolishing, and freezing a multitude of properties as it traversed the landscape in search of a cold environment. A search that eventually led it to an oil refinery, which would have been engulfed in flames if it continued its march through the location. Realizing the lack of an alternative, Jack changed into Ultraman, and after a quick scuffle, the scared and suffering creature was successfully put out of its misery when Ultraman used its own freeze ray against itself. In Episode 6, The Showdown, which I think is actually my favorite episode, the Gudis tries to gain control over Jean Echo after infecting her at the end of Episode 5. At first, it succeeds, forcing her to kill 2 medical technicians, and nearly killing Jack. Off and on through the remainder of the episode, Jean would bring out her human conscience, before the Gudis would once again dominate the foremost part of her thoughts, as Jack struggled to keep her mind from the alien parasite, constantly reminding her of who she is as a human being. Thankfully, upon Ultraman's defeat of Gudis, Jean was able to fully recover the dominance of her mind, taking Jack into a heartfelt embrace for saving her life from the alien menace. And yes, you heard that correctly. Gudis dies in Episode 6 of a 13-episode show. Seriously. He's the primary antagonist, causing the corruption of any organism he encounters, leading Yuma into a death-defying struggle to keep the continent and the planet safe from the evil entity and the fauna it spawns in its wake, and nearly killing one of Yuma's own members at the end of its storyline. And then, just before we reach the midpoint of the show, the writer decided to just kill him off shortly after he emerges in his ultimate form. After that, every succeeding episode just featured either another alien that makes a standalone episode appearance, a monster lurking somewhere in an isolated location, or a mutation that was spawned from mankind's actions that simultaneously ended up polluting or damaging the environment, which thus intensified the show's eco-protection theme to an even further degree than how it was presented during the Gudis saga. Now, that's not to say that the post-Gudis episodes didn't have their own merits. There were some enjoyable episodes that have some memorable characters and monsters in them. Like Episode 9, which had kind of a horror movie feel to it. In Episode 10, which had an alien duo that came to Earth as tourists, where Charles begins to bond with the female visitor, while the feds attempt to track down and capture the visitors. It just perplexes me that the writer introduced us to a major alien threat, slowly building up our anticipation for the ultimate final showdown between the Menace and Ultraman, only to get rid of him long before the official finale. It would have been at least a little innovative if Terry Larson had left at least a remnant of Gudis around to further damage the Yuma team in succeeding episodes. For example, maybe Jean Echo wasn't as cleansed from the Gudis as they first thought, leading to the virus steadily taking over her will to hinder the actions of Yuma. Or just anything that would have given the monster more of a purpose than simply relying on fodder for the titular hero until the finale. In my opinion, Gudis was an interesting villain who deserved so much more. The only other monsters that closely resembled planet-threatening villains were the final two creatures, Kodara and Shalagi, though they're depicted as not exactly evil, but pawns to keep the humans from interfering with the Earth's natural ways. However, since they go out of their way to drive the point across, destroying ships, cities, and anything in their way, as well as hundreds, even thousands of people most likely, I think I can safely refer to them as the bad guys, no matter how the story tries to explain that we humans are the cause for the two monsters' calling and chaos.
The only places we can't scan are caverns underneath the continental shelf.
Well, let's mine them.
That could set up earth jammers. It's seismologically unstable.
You can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs.
The egg you're proposing to crack is the one we're living on.
You finally flipped, Grant.
William Blake saw the possibility 200 years ago.
And how do we fight a battle with metaphysics?
We don't. We've seen the enemy, and he is us.
Considering the two monsters are seemingly hell-bent on destroying the very planet they were called forth to protect, they do a pretty crappy job at keeping it intact and pollution-free. A mission that even the Earth sucks at. What with the toxic algae it unleashes upon the seas. Keep in mind, all of this was orchestrated by the Earth, whatever sense that makes, to teach mankind a lesson about offering a helping hand and healing the planet that gives us our sanctuary and livelihood, as opposed to trying to dominate it. Imagine if the final two episodes were about a sorcerer who created this madness all because a dentist called him in for a routine checkup, or because a doctor needed to perform a surgery on him. Would have been equally as senseless, but slightly more logical than the Earth being the culprit behind the apocalyptic finale to the series. For a show that was said to be the most expensive Ultra series at that point, the result really doesn't show itself very visibly. That's not to say the effects are dreadful or anything, but needless to say, there are a few hits and misses throughout the 13 episodes. First, let's go over the good and decent effects. Both Ultraman and his plethora of alien and monster opponents are very appealing in their respective design. As per tradition for giant monster tokusatsu, the suits for all the monsters in the series are made of rubber. But for the first time in franchise history, this titular Ultraman suit is actually made of spandex, sort of like the costumes used for the Super Sentai heroes, or Power Rangers. This may have been done to reduce the risk of damaging the suit, which would be used extensively throughout the 13 episodes in a variety of intense action and effects scenes. I can tell the crew really understood the importance of adding quality to the suits, as the monsters are very intriguing through their creation. My personal favorites are Dagunja, Gigasaurus, Bogan, and Garukadon. And I can safely say the crew took advantage of that supposed high budget. As just like I said in my Zone Fighter retrospective, all the monsters in this series were designed from scratch, never reusing the model of a former monster from the show, a preceding Ultraman entry, or the Godzilla movies, which at this point had already made 2 movies in the Heisei era. It must have been pretty ballsy for the studio to allow the effects crew to mold these suits from no other pre-existing material, as like I said earlier, they went all out with their creative work. For starters, they invented a large multitude of beasts that all varied in different sizes, especially Gudis in both his original and his final form, and Rugolo, who straight up towers over Ultraman. Both aliens were enormous in their full size, especially Gudis' final form, thanks to his exceptionally long tail. What is it with tokusatsu and monsters with strangely elongated tails, anyway? And more, a number of monsters were brought to life not just through the power of suitmation, but also through smaller robotic props and handheld puppets that were used for small-scale effects settings, like Gigasaurus during his traversal across the country, and Barongus during his initial city attack. When the time came to pit the antagonist against Ultraman, both creatures were strictly portrayed by a guy in a suit to perform more natural and intense motions in combat. For the Gigasaurus suit, the legs were designed in a way that the stuntman could actually traverse the area across the set while keeping his hands and feet planted firmly on the ground, as opposed to the tradition of using 2 stunt actors for this particular effect. This suit was also constructed so that the man inside could stand up on his legs, which made the closing battle with Ultraman that much more interesting. One of my favorite creature effects on the show was Garukadon, which was performed not by a man in a suit, but was actually a large puppet operated by wires and robotic instruments under the molding. It's a very rare occurrence for Tsuburaya to create a monster that isn't worn as a costume, which is understandable, as wire-operated puppetry can be a stingy effect to successfully pull off. And convincingly, for that matter. But here, they did it very well, I have to say, as most of Garukadon's on-screen movements seem rather convincing for the most part. And the way how he was controlled through wireworks actually gave his movements a very unnatural and otherworldly vibe, especially when he was hovering in place. My personal favorite monster from this show is Dagunja, mostly because of his recognizable design, which was based on the Tasmanian Devil. His physical traits make him seem very unique amongst the abundant army of the Ultra monsters because of his oddly disproportionate head, which I think is effective at making him that much more appealing to look at. He kind of reminds me of those rhino pig things from At the Earth's Core. If I had to offer a complaint about him, it's that he had very little screen time in his standalone episode. More specifically, I hate that he had the least amount of screen time amongst all the monsters in this series. There is one more gripe I have with his fight with Ultraman, but I'll get onto that a little later. Aside from the monsters all having original suits, the vocalizations of the monsters were also original. This is a stark contrast to the Ultraman shows that came before and after this, which often featured monsters that rocked the voice of a monster from the Godzilla or Gamera movies, or a past Ultraman monster. For example, Red King's shriek was a high-pitched combo of King Kong and Godzilla. Balton's voice was the laugh of the Mushroom Men from Matango. Zambolar used Gamera's vocals. Among other such examples. But for this entry, each monster expelled a roar, shriek, or snarl that was unique to the show, as were the vocals and other sound effects of Ultraman great. Even the laser blasts and explosions had their own original noises. Admittedly, they did reuse some of Bogan's noises for Garukadan, Godara, and Shalagi, but the Foley crew at least had the good sense to modify the pitch so that the sound would seem more distinct for each monster most of the time. And I really love Great's vocals that he uses in combat, which go from sounding ghost-like to something like a robot, as opposed to the traditional schwatch sounds of Ultraman. And unlike what's traditionally done in tokusatsu, most of the fight scenes and monster rampage scenes are not always filmed on a soundstage, but actually on a miniaturized set that's been placed outdoors. Most of the time, these shots actually work very well, giving us more natural lighting provided by the sun, simulating a more realistic-looking environment being scorched by the intense Australian temperatures. The model city buildings all look neatly detailed and authentic, as do the explosions that are caused during the monster invasions. And the scenes look even more creative thanks to the casual plumes of smoke that are blown on the set to add additional atmosphere. Though I can't help but wonder how strenuous it must have been for the stuntmen to wander around in that extreme outdoor heat while stuck inside a rubber suit with limited ventilation. Ultraman's suit was made of spandex, which I can assume made the experience a tad bit more bearable, but reportedly, there was one occasion where the actor was so stifled by the internal heat that he actually fainted on the set. Yikes.
Something smells good. What?
Hey guys, take a look at this.
You'll be sorry you got involved in this.
You're just making things worse.
What are you, an expert on these morons?
Just a small bit for me. Thanks.